Sorry, I'm a little late, and I'll have to leave 10, 15 minutes before the end of the lecture because I have to drop somebody at the airport. It's quite urgent, so sorry that I'll have to kind of quickly go through what I have to go through today. And I don't have a lapel mic, but I think I can project my voice loud enough. Can you hear me?
No, can you hear you now? I'm going to keep you first.
When you said no, I knew you could hear. Yeah. What do you call it? The roving mic has run out of battery, so I'm just going to have to project. So today we're going to talk about the joys of motherhood, which is a text by a very important African writer, Buchi Emecheta, one of the pioneering female writers in the continent. And I'm hoping that you managed to get a hold of the book. It was published in 1979, and she is considered one of the earliest writers in the continent, at least in the modern, at the time that modern institutions around storytelling were being set, who was grappling with the gender as a category of analysis, as a category of identity, in various aspects of gender, as you can see in the novel. So what I'm going to try and do is to try and frame Buchi Emecheta in relation to African literary feminism, or African feminist literary criticism. It's the rise of African feminism, the rise of feminism as an intellectual project in the continent. Obviously, one can't do justice to how big and how wide and how complex feminism as an intellectual project is, but I'll just put out a few pointers, drop a few names that I'm hoping you can pick up on your own and figure this out, and then we can just quickly talk about the text, and then I'm going to have to dash out very quickly. Can you hear me at the back?
Maybe we should sound forward.
I'm so sorry. Usually the roving mic, they usually leave it charging here. I think someone might have forgotten to leave it there, so kind of run out of battery. Can you hear me at the back? Okay. If you can't hear me, if at any point you can't hear me, just raise your hand and I'll try and project. So just a few biographical facts about Buchi Emecheta is that she was born in July 1944 in Nigeria, and she moved to the UK at the age of 16 in 1960. Studied sociology at the University of London, and she moved to the UK because she was getting married to someone that she had been betrothed, and it turned out to be a really crazy marriage, and it was violent. And part of her project of writing was actually to grapple with her status as a woman and as a mother who wanted to pursue her own profession and go to school. And so if you read many of her novels, there are a few biographical things that come up in those novels. One of the interesting things was that when she was growing up as a girl, she had to convince her father the importance of going to school, because she was overlooked in favor of her brothers, and eventually she was sent to school, and she ended up being the person that she is. So she's one of the pioneering female modern African authors, and she has over 20 books that she's published. And the ones that I've put there are just a few, the ones that are more popular and more widely read. And you can tell from the titles that there are certain thematic concerns that are important for her. When she moved to the UK and got married to this guy, she ended up getting 5 kids, And at some point, her husband, I think, was quite jealous of her kind of writing profession. And she had published, I think, 2 or 3 novels. And he ended up taking one of the manuscripts for, I think, the Bride Prize, and actually burning it. Sure. And then she had to recover it and rewrite it again. And you know, so she's a really interesting author in that regard. But of course, you know, also very accomplished and in some ways a trailblazer for many female authors in the continent in that regard. So over 20 books. These are just some of the few that she's known for. Destination Biafra is particularly interesting because I don't know if you're aware of the civil war that took place in Nigeria between 1967 and 1970. It's been a topic of conversation for a while. She's one of the few female authors who tries to grapple with not just the role of women, but the consciousness around gender and sexuality in relation to that war at the time. But what is interesting about her, the kind of, if I could call them the contexts of gender in Nigeria that go back to the late 19th century, and I'm going to talk about it. There's a long history of women who mobilized at different times in the country, in the face of British colonialism, in the face of local forms of patriarchy, in the face of various forms of economic organization. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But Destination Biafra is an interesting text in regards to that whole narrative about the Civil War. And you know that close to 3 million people died at the time. Most of them were children. Those of you who would have read stories or watched videos or been alive at the time, you would have known that there were campaigns all over the world to try and resolve the crisis that led to the conflict. Basically, if I can quickly just summarize what the Biafran War was about, the southeastern state of the country decided to secede from the larger Federal Republic of Nigeria. And this is part of what we have been trying to grapple with people like Ngugi and Aiko Eyama, the crisis of the nation state, when different groups of people are suddenly forced to live together, and they have to refer to themselves as Nigerians or South Africans. Often these kinds of conflicts began to emerge. And what's interesting about Nigeria is that the northern part of the country was predominantly Muslim. It had a long history of Islamic contact from North Africa and from Asia. And so for centuries, it was very much embedded in Islamic civilization. And then the southern part was more somewhere in between Christian and tradition, somewhere in between longer contact with Europe and the kind of local customs. So there are 3 very, very disparate regions, not just in language, but also in religion, in culture, and all of that. And the British colonial governor at the time, in the early 20th century, Frederick Lugard, apparently sitting in his kitchen, decided, let's just put all of these regions together and call them one country. And they were lumped together, and they became, British colonial Nigeria. And even though there was an awareness that the people in the north did not want to associate themselves with the people in the south, they had their own way of doing things. And so when you think about Boko Haram, you heard about Boko Haram. Mm-hmm. One has to go back to those histories of map making, these decisions that are made around how borders of countries, how different countries become nation states in that regard. It's always fascinating when we think about Lesotho's relationship geographically to South Africa, which is a country in another country. Often when you look at a map, countries are contiguous to each other, and there's a really weird concentric relationship, and this assumption that Lesotho is radically different, and that it has to be borders around it in relation to South Africa. So it's map making, has a long history of kind of imperialism that one has to grapple with. So Boko Haram, the effects of Boko Haram, for me, when we think about Boko Haram now, we have to go back to those earlier kind of imperial forms of map making, decisions that were made around cartography. So Biafra then ended up becoming one of the biggest flashpoints in Nigeria's history. And there was obviously it wasn't just the cultural differences. There was the oil, and the resources of oil that were in the southeastern part of the country, and the relationship to that oil with the British and the French and other people with all sorts of interests. So it's quite an interesting, It's fine. I hope you can still hear me at the back. Can you hear me? Thank you. So some of the kind of ongoing thematic concerns for Buchi and Macheta are questions around motherhood, child slavery, and particularly when she moved to the UK in 1960, she began to obviously be conscious of race and the intersections between her race as a black woman, her race as black, and her gender as a woman at the time. And if you read some of her novels, Second-Class Citizens, I assume, comes from the idea that she's not just a woman, but she's black and she's an immigrant at the same time. So these intersections of identity began to become very clear for her as part of what was described at the time as black British identity. And one can take that in all sorts of directions. She's obviously also interested in freedom through education, especially for girls. And from our own kind of personal history, many of her novels are always trying to grapple with the tensions that usually come out of the way families are organized in relation to the division of labor and the roles that men and women are supposed to play in those kinds of intimate spaces. And I also have, sorry, wow, what happened there? Okay. So if we decide to place Buchi and Macheta amongst our contemporaries, these are some of the other names that on you can pick up and see people who were writing at the time as well. So Flora Noapa, very famous Nigerian author as well. We know Bessie Head, she's considered Buchi and Macheta's contemporary as well. Mariama Ba from Senegal, Ama Ataidu, Aminata Sofo, Grace Ogot from Kenya, Zainab Al-Khali, Miriam Tlali, South African, Zulu Sofola, Nigerian, amongst many others. So early 60s. And obviously if you look at the African Writers series when it was set up, it was predominantly male. And it's people like Buchi and Macheta who opened up that space for more stories from women, Flora Noapa and particularly Buchi and Macheta published significantly with African Writers series. So they were really trailblazing in terms of publication of stories by women and in the continent. So if we can just open that kind of generation up amongst all those women, these are some of the names that you can think about. I don't know if you recognize any of these names. Bessie Head? Mariama Ba?
Yeah.
Do you remember Mariama Ba's Solon Letter?
Yes.
Any other? Ama Ataidu?
Yes, The Name of the Ghost.
The Name of the Ghost? Who authored No Sweetness Here?
Same.
Huh? Is it Ama Ataidu? Yeah. So these are really, really important female authors from the country. And they're just, not all of them, obviously. I mean, there are a whole range of others that I'm sure you might know. I just put those out there. So just to kind of build some theoretical context for what we're talking about. Some of the key concerns for people like Buchi and Macheta was the representation of gender in African literature, how gender as a topic, as a theme, was represented. And if you are thinking about someone like Chinua Achebe, for instance, in Things Fall Apart, you'll see that he's kind of creating a society that had very clear gender roles, right? At least in the way that they're represented in the novel. But the kind of archive that Achebe consulted to kind of craft his story, Igboland, mid-19th century, mid to late 19th century, also had its own cracks. And so one of the things that, for instance, Achebe has been accused of eliding in terms of that kind of archive is some of the mobilizations amongst women, and some of the revolts and the organized kinds of rebellion amongst women in the late 19th century, early 20th century in Ebola. And there's this assumption that Okonkwo as a figure, or the men in that society are extremely dominant, and the women are all passive, and, even though he doesn't necessarily represent all women as passive. I mean, they're very complex female characters in the novel. But it began to emerge that African and black women needed to begin writing into that archive and coming up with their own stories. And so Flora Nwapa, one of the authors that I've mentioned earlier, her first novel, I think it was Efuru, was a kind of a writing back to this male tradition of African writing, particularly people like Achebe and the others. So gender, as it's represented in African literature, is a key and important topic in the first generation of African writers in the first decade of independence. Thinking about gender as an identity category, obviously some of these debates have shifted over the years. When we talk about sexuality, we begin to open up a whole range of other interesting things with regards to sexuality and the analysis of identity, as opposed to just gender as kind of a broader, bigger category. And particularly in post-colonial African literature, what are the connections between gender and the nation? What are the connections between what is the future of gender as a category in a nation that is trying to imagine itself? In other words, not just the roles of women. Every time I talk about role, it sounds very, when you hear people talk about the role of women, it sounds very, how do I put it, instrumental. And yet it's obviously more than that. There's also a kind of a consciousness, there's philosophical principles around that. It's not just the kinds of roles that men and women play. But post-colonial identity had to be rethought through gender as a category of analysis. So gender and nationalism in Africa became an important topic at the time that Uche Macheta and them were writing. And therefore then the rise of feminism as an intellectual movement. And people often get this wrong. When people talk about feminism, some people think that there's this assumption that the kinds of practices that conceptualize and theorize around feminism are new. And often one has to remind people that the word is used to refer to an intellectual movement. It does not mean that there were no forms of mobilizing amongst women or any kind of consciousness around gender before these concepts came up. So one has to make it clear that, as an intellectual movement, in terms of how societies organize themselves in institutions and how people's lives are organized, as an intellectual movement. And this is why, for instance, when you look at the history of mobilization amongst women in that part of the world where Uche Macheta comes from, if you're thinking about the mid-19th century, feminism as an intellectual concept wasn't there, at least in the way that people were thinking and writing, or in academic spaces. So one has to constantly make that distinction. So again, I just want to mention a few names here that of people who theorized and thought about feminism in relation to the continent. I don't know if you recognize any of those names, so you can just kind of Google them on your own. Florence Stratton, and these were like early thinkers. So you're thinking about the 60s, the late 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, like people who began thinking at the time when modern African literature was set up about feminism in the context of the continent. Obviously, we know feminism as an intellectual movement goes back to early 20th century in Europe, in the 30s and the 40s. But the context of the continent, these are some of the people who've been writing about it. And some of them have come up with specific words that refer to specific kind of local valences of feminism. And the examples I'm giving there, Stewanism and negofeminism. And of course, the debates are, as I pointed out earlier, a lot more different. Not different, but they have evolved over time. I mean, this is 40, 50 years of this kind of thinking. When we talk about sexuality in the continent, one has to think about queer identity in the continent as a kind of a rising, important category of identity and analysis. And we know that South Africa's constitution was one of the first in the continent to recognize queer identity. And what is interesting, at least in the way that I saw it, queer citizenship became the benchmark within which to then begin to judge our human rights and how previously radically marginalized identities could be imagined in a new nation. So sexuality, queer sexuality at the moment is an important category of analysis in relation to sexuality and gender. Right? So all sorts of formulations have come up: gender non-conforming, beyond just what we know as gay, lesbian, transgender. So it's a much more complex field of analysis, and this is obviously very early, perceptions of it and very early thinking around it in the continent. I don't know if you know Dinyavango Inaina in Kenya. He's one of the kind of leading public intellectuals around queer sexuality, and many parts of the continent are extremely homophobic, and legislations around sexuality are quite rampant across the continent. So just to update us on these debates. So you can look at some of these people online and see what you make of them. Very important thinkers. Are there any questions up to this point? I'm going to leave around 20 minutes for questions because I have to leave a little bit early. And then, so many of these thinkers that I've just mentioned before, these people who were thinking about feminism in Africa, began to notice certain patterns around the representation of women, particularly in male-authored texts. And one of the things was that the woman was used as a trope. Africa figured as a trope of a woman. And that was a general kind of form of representation. It was quite common amongst male-authored texts, obviously because of certain cultural ideas around gender in relation to nationalism. And obviously this was a time when a lot of these women were thinking about the literary traditions that were extremely masculine, extremely male, and therefore very normative at the time, and to find ways of critiquing them. And it turned out, as you would read many of early 60s, first decade of independence, women simply figured as mere symbologies of the nation. There's something merely symbolic, as opposed to grappling with the actual lives on the ground of women who were in intimate and in public spaces, and the kind of work that they were doing in terms of trying to think about a new nation. And so the representation of women then, for this kind of criticism that was coming up in the 60s amongst these intellectuals, was that women merely figured as symbologies of the nation. In other words, it meant that the discourse of nationalism excluded women. That's what it meant, that they simply figured as symbols, but they were not included in the actual planning and the actual thinking and the actual, thinking about these new nations. And so, that kind of feminist critique became a critique of nationalism itself. And the nations were gendered as female, and yet the women were excluded and marginalized within homesteads and public life. And many of the representations of women are very flat and dichotomized, either because women coming into colonial modernity and now post-colonial modernity were supposed to occupy very specific roles in these economies. And you'll see when you read through Joys of Motherhood that there's a dynamic between the rural area and the urban area. Obviously, there are different cultural geographies, if I can call them that. And if you're thinking about many of the cities in the continent, whether it's Johannesburg or Nairobi or Cape Town or Lagos, for instance, Nairobi at the cusp of independence in the 60s, late 50s, early 60s, city spaces were very much masculine spaces because the kinds of labor that was required spaces were predominantly male at the time, or assumed to be predominantly male at the time. And so the entry of women into many of these African cities was extremely marginalized women entered these spaces as very marginalized figures, and they then began to be seen as simply people who would then kind of come into the economies of leisure. So, for instance, sex work became one of the kind of typologies of the labor that women provided in these cities. And so many of the earlier representations of women are very much tapped into these kinds of cultural geographies of the city. And it was a purely colonial construct. The labor that was required, extracted from the hinterland into the cities, was very much one that defined gender roles and decided the men had to come to Johannesburg to be mine workers, and they'd have to leave their women in other parts of the country, and then women would have to raise those families, and and that then opened up all sorts of issues around the organization of the family, the kind of cultural construct of the family, and I think that part of what we are dealing with today in terms of the debates around identity kind of come from the way the movement of people in and around city spaces, urban and rural areas, was legislated, it was defined, and therefore it began to tinker with various cultural geographies that have been existing in many of these spaces for many years. So the city and the rural area became kind of they had this very tense relationship as cultural geographies. And you'll see in the novel that when the protagonist moves to Lagos, it's a culture shock. Partly because, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, that forms of colonial labor that were required from the colonized very much feminized these men. And the protagonist in the novel, her husband, does a cleaning for his master. And then there's a very kind of weird tension between what she expects for him to do from how she understands how men do work at home and in the city. And so there are interesting connections between colonialism and patriarchy. And there are people who've made arguments around colonialism as a system, in fact, reinforcing gender roles within societies in the continent. That it in fact bolstered patriarchy as a kind of cultural construct. So these are some of the kind of issues that these critics were trying to tease out in these early representations of the continent. So I'm talking about colonialism and patriarchy. Sorry for the wrong spelling. An important kind of theorist around that is Anne McClinton. She has a book called Imperial Leather. It's titled Imperial Leather. It looks at how she says something interesting about the way British colonialism, how it visualized the kinds of metaphors that British colonialism generated around its, how do I put it, its interaction with the colonies. And they were very, very sexualized. The continent, for instance, was supposed to be this geography which was supposed to be penetrated. And there are all these, she draws a whole range of metaphors from a kind of a colonial archive. So she's an important figure in that regard, in making those connections. You can look up and on. So, if I can just put out a quote here from Efuru's Flora Mapa's Efuru, which the title of the text that we're talking about today comes from. It's right there. Efuru slept soundly that night. She dreamt of the woman of the lake, her beauty, her long hair, and her riches. She had lived for ages at the bottom of the lake. She was as old as the lake itself. She was happy, she was wealthy, she was beautiful. She gave women beauty and wealth, but she had no child. She had never experienced the joy of motherhood. Why then did the women worship her? And if you read through the novel, you come across these mythical figures of women. The water goddess. It's an enduring metaphor in West African literature. There are all these figures, mythical figures, who are gendered in a certain way, who are quite abiding in many of the narratives of women at the time. And they could tap into those kind of mythical narratives to try and understand the complexity of this changing world in relation to gender. And I assume that this kind of intertextual connection between the novel we're reading today and Flora Mapa's Efuru is quite clear from that statement. So, in terms of the text itself, we know that it's set in Lagos in around 1934. Just 10, 15 years before British colonialism ended in Nigeria. And the other thing I'm flagging out there is that there was the Aba Women's War in 1929, which was one of the historical flashpoints where women collectively organized themselves to fight the colonial chiefs who had been imposed on them and who were putting all these restrictions around how they could carry out their own trade as women who control the markets, the food markets, for instance. And they organized themselves and they brought down quite a number of these colonial chiefs.
In Nigeria?
Yes, in 1929. And in 1910, there was another riot again. A group of women organized themselves. And it was about staking out their role socially, politically, economically within this kind of emerging colonial modernity. Right? So there's a whole range of historical moments around these women who are organizing themselves that is, for a long time, wasn't out there in the public. So someone like Achebe in Things Fall Apart does not quite acknowledge those important historical flashpoints in the world that is quite trying to represent. And these are just one or two moments. There are many others. Mid-19th, late 19th, early 20th century, historically. So one would assume that the context in which Buchi Emecheta is writing, the time of the novel, if I can put it that way, kind of taps into that historical flashpoint. And of course, in the novel, the migrations between Ibuza, which is the kind of rural area, and Lagos in the city, and the clear divisions of labor, and the politics of gender that begins to arise out of that. The protagonist's expectations of her role in this new kind of urban environment, her expectations of her husband's role in this new urban environment, when she becomes a mother, again, various expectations around motherhood. And as a mother, her relationship to her sons and her daughters. There's a whole range of kind of the lives of these women that many of the male authors were not really representing. And I think Buchi Emecheta, amongst the others, began to open that up. And so one can talk about the tension between colonial modernity and family life, and to begin to see gender as a social construct. And this is a basic idea. Gender as a social construct, various ideas around femininity and masculinity, definitions of them, expectations of them, the roles that each of these are supposed to occupy. And particularly for Buchi Emecheta and the protagonist in the novel, mother. The idea that motherhood had to be put on a pedestal and every woman had to be judged on that account. And therefore, one can talk about gender as a social construct. And I'm just going to put up two quotes by two important people that I'm sure you might have heard, Judith Butler, talking about a stylized repetition of acts which are internally discontinuous, so that the appearance of substance is precisely that, a constructed identity, a performative accomplishment which the mundane social audience, including the actors themselves, come to believe and to perform in the mode of belief. That's what social construction of gender, and particularly sexuality in the part of Judith Butler, is about. And then there's Stephen Frosch, who's a psychoanalyst, who talks about masculinity and femininity as constructions which are built around anatomical difference, signifying only because they are granted significance in the context of the particular power relationships that constitute and historically have constituted our social environment. And so he draws connections between the performance of gender and sexuality in relation to power. That's a slightly different dynamic of thinking about gender, but which is kind of overarching in the way roles of gender are assigned and assumed to be hierarchically inferior or superior to others. So just two quotes, and you can come up with a whole range of other scholars who try to define what social construction is about. So in The Joys of Motherhood, constructions of gender, and particularly motherhood, are very clear. Constructions of ideal masculinity or even ideal femininity. Constantly the protagonist is told that this is your relationship to your husband. You must remember, whether you're here in the village or in the city, you have to keep in mind that this is the kind of ideal woman and mother that you're supposed to be throughout the novel. And she's constantly battling to kind of see the contradictions between those two spaces, a rural area and the city. Obviously, the connections between colonialism and patriarchy in relation to our own husband, and his employers, and all of these characters, all of these male characters in the novel who are trying to enter the colonial economy. They are placed at different, very complex situations. If you read through the novel, you can see that there's an emerging critique around their own sense of masculinity in relation to the colonial economy. And there's a tension between pre-colonial constructions of gender and the kind of colonial reconstructions of gender that the protagonist has to constantly grapple with. Because the rural area for her is her frame of reference. When she thinks about Ibuza, when she thinks about men and women, boys and girls in her mind, her first frame of reference is the rural area where she comes from. And while living in the city, she can sense that there are a lot of tensions, and there's a lot of kind of things that are now up in the air in that regard. And I'm just mentioning the characters that are in relation to motherhood, who each of them present very different versions of motherhood. Ona, the protagonist's mother, the protagonist herself, and Adaku, who's a co-wife in this kind of polygamous family system. And how the author organizes these characters as foils and contrasts of each other. And I think only someone like Buchi Emecheta could come up with a narrative that tries to explore the complexity of motherhood and how different forms of mothering, different forms of consciousness around mothering between different characters can actually be represented. At the time, in the 1960s and 1970s, this was suddenly something new and interesting to grapple with. Obviously now, these kinds of narratives are more normative now. People are more aware and conscious that motherhood is a vastly complicated construction around gender, and that the roles that one expects to take on in relation to motherhood have obviously become more complex as the years go by, especially if you factor in same-sex relationships that are becoming, very common and very important to think about across the world. It's a whole different way of thinking about parenting. Again, just reiterating, Lagos and Ibuza as kind of different cultural geographies, construction of labor, the different family structures, polygamy in Lagos in the city as opposed to in the rural areas, and the construction of motherhood in these two different areas. Yep. I'm going to stop there. And then I'm going to ask if there are any questions, whether questions from the first two lectures, or if I can just, or comments, or, yeah.
I just have a question in regards to a lot of African women writers. There's a huge gap between those first intellectual women who were writing and the African women who are writing now. Why do you think that is? Because it's like quite a huge gap, in the writing of women writers, just basically in Africa.
You mean a gap in what sense? In terms of?
In terms of like there was a huge influx of women writers during the time that when she was writing, and now there was like a period where it was like really, really quiet to get a woman writer who was African, and now there's another huge influx. What do you think those gaps are caused by in terms of history or literature, or what do you think that is?
I think we can talk about publishing and how publishing as an industry in the 80s really just went down. It became very fragmented. The Cold War was happening, and then structural adjustment programs at the end of the 80s came up, and many publishing economies just collapsed. And in fact, what happened? The history of the continent in terms of these genres, or in terms of cultural production, then kind of shifted into the popular space. So if you think about the rise of popular culture, you're thinking about the late 70s, throughout the 80s and the 90s. So that is one answer. So you can talk about publishing as an important, and it affected publishing both men and women. So that for me is a key factor that plays into that. But I think the contemporary moment has more women writers than ever. I mean, you can point out like 100 or even 150 young women writers from the continent now. They're numerous now, and so it's flourishing. So that would be the one answer that I can give you, because I think the African literature as a kind of creative enterprise began facing challenges, partly because of the Cold War and the structural adjustment programs, but also partly because of the problems of nationalism that were already simmering on the ground and became kind of full-blown, really conflicts around many African countries, and that meant that government attempts to subsidize publishing, to support publishing houses, went down the drain. So the African Writers series by the late 70s was pretty much off the table. And publishing houses, East African educational publishers, which Heinemann in Nigeria also went down, and those were big publishing houses at the time. And they went down precisely because, one, the global economy was changing. Many African countries had all these governments that were not invested in a creative economy, I think, but also there was a lot of suspicion towards literacy and towards, because fiction is a space that can challenge a lot of ideas about ourselves. Often people test ideas through an experimental space, and so fiction becomes a space where people begin to challenge certain ideas of imagining themselves. And so a lot of censorship, a lot of, that's the way I can, I'm sure there are other reasons that one can also think about. But certainly the contemporary moment, at least since the turn of the century, has produced numerous young female writers, numerous. It's an amazing time to think about Africa as a kind of space of imagination, I think. Any other comments or questions? Yes?
I was thinking maybe a lot of women were excluded, their writings were excluded, maybe because people did not take women's writing seriously either. They valued more the male voices, because traditionally that has been the voice. And perhaps when a woman writer wants to join the club, there are many restrictions, there are many, she's judged a different way, she's judged maybe the way a man should be judged, although writing as a woman, I'll write in a certain way because that's how I see, feel, experience things compared to a male person.
Yes, that is certainly one of the reasons, I think.
Sorry, could you repeat it a little?
She says that, in terms of answering her question, she's saying that already women in the 60s and the 70s, their writing wasn't taken seriously. Already, anyway. So the gap that she's talking about is partially informed by that fact. And it's true. Even, you're thinking about Buche Mecheta, Florence Mabo, these early modern female writers. Their works didn't see as much critical attention as male writers. So it's certainly one of the effects already of that period. Yes?
I'm ignorant. That is wonderful upsurge of writing that you're talking about. Is it in English? Is it in French? Is it in all African languages since the turn of the century?
It's in various languages, mostly in English. At least what I work on as an academic. But in various languages. But you can find a lot of them in English. East Africa, West Africa. This is a lot. It's a lot. I think that the summer school lectures I gave last year they were about contemporary young writers. So, any other questions?
I just want to add, I think usually the colonial language that we inherit becomes the main language we use to write books. So if you went to Angola or something, you find that Portuguese more than in Champagne. And then the same thing will happen if you go to the Congo. In either the Congo, the French speaking, the books in French, if we have it in Arabic. Just the nature of things.
feminism rather than nationalism from the female writers?
Which ones? These ones, or the ones you're talking about,
Yes.
or the ones, the contemporary ones?
Well, both.
These ones.
And the ones from the 60s when independence was all coming and all that was happening, they were pushing a feminist agenda in spite of this rise of nationalism. Now, is feminism to a woman writer more important than nationalism?
I see the two together because I think part of the rise of feminism, at least in the context of the continent, was that there was this divide between the public and the private. Right? And this assumption that the public was the national and it was the kind of hierarchically superior space of thinking about identity. When in fact the private is a big part of the equation and it's kind of hitched the public. At least that is one argument that one can put up. So I think those two go together. And so one can talk about gender and nationalism as generating an important critique of this idea of the nation. And so a lot of these women were saying the kind of private spaces, the intimate spaces that they were resigned to their daily lives were as equally important in thinking about the idea of a collective identity of the nation as the kind of public spaces which were male dominated, whether it's public service and often the nation, the idea of the nation comes from this martial, this martial thing, and martial identities are predominantly masculine, and they're predominantly public. Right? So I see them together in that sense. But I think that arguments around nationalism now are slightly different from earlier, and obviously because the world is more the movement of information and people and goods and services and even identities is so transnational, multinational. So the nation state as a space of thinking about oneself is increasingly becoming marginalized and thinking about identity, because of the movement of people. I think my opinion is that the nation state needs to die. I think as a form of identity, it's not yielding any sustainable solutions anymore. Even though Brexit is happening and there's the rise of the very right-wing government.
And we have Mr. Trump.
And Trump it will just take us back to what we've been running away from. Often because, again, nation states are very constructed. Boundaries are so arbitrary. The cultural marks that existed before that were a lot more fluid. So if you think about, say, in Southern Africa, if you think about the Zulu kingdom, which had been around forever, by the mid-18th century. Mid-18th century when it began to decline, and mid-19th when it was trying to expand itself even further. We know that the effects of that go all the way up to Zimbabwe and all the way up to Tanzania. There are people who fled these kingdoms, and they're in Tanzania. So how do you begin to assume that they are native to Tanzania and that that's where they belong, and that those borders that separate them? How do you even begin to? So I don't know. I just think that the nation state needs to die as a construct. This idea of citizenship. Yes.
Just to add on what she's asking or questioning, if you're a writer who has been deprived of your own voice within a certain nation, when you start writing and finding your voice, one of the most important things for you is your identity. And so for me, feminism and nationalism also live together, because you are asserting yourself as that person who's been deprived of writing within that space, and you're telling people that you belong in that space. So for me, they have to have a symbiotic relationship, because as much as you're coming out as a woman, but you're coming out as a Zulu woman or a Xhosa woman who has never had the opportunity to actually do the writing.
But is it not cultural? I mean, can it not be a cultural thing as opposed to a nation state? And maybe the emphasis needs to be changed a bit to look more at culture and tradition, but not at the geographical entity that is the nation.
Often
particularly in a globalized sort of world where, you know, yes, the things is moving around.
Often, in fact, people who are in international relations and in politics will tell you that the word state added onto the word nation is what then kind of generates the geopolitics of the whole construct. That now there are borders, and that one can demarcate and say this nation state starts and ends here. But the idea of a nation itself is very culturally defined. You know, it's about nation in terms of the primary definition of nation. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does make sense, but it still then means it's nothing to do with borders necessarily. I mean, you could use the example of the Zulu kingdom, or I could say the Shanti kingdom in Ghana. It doesn't refer to the whole of Ghana or the whole of South Africa.
Again, that might be debatable because even the Zulu kingdom extended itself beyond KwaZulu-Natal. It was annexing land all over. It was a southern African phenomenon.
But it didn't come down here.
But it did cover a significant chunk of southern Africa.
It did.
But you know, the idea of citizenship in relation to a nation is so fraught. And you carry a passport or an ID card, you know. And you think about it, and then, you know, you think about people in Lesotho, and you think about the porosity of that cultural geography, and it's unfathomable how one can just police the movement of people clearly, geographically, culturally, you know. It doesn't make sense, and these are obviously, you know, recent histories of collective identity, and you know, I don't know what, you know, 100 years from now, how the world is going to look like, because these ideas are constantly coming under challenge. But I think we might have a new platform of collective identity under Leah's time. Yes.
Which makes me pick up on something else that I picked up from your lectures, which is the movement of writers that people who grew up in Nigeria and were in London by the time they were 16 and so on. Is it still necessary for the scattering of people, for their voices to be heard, or, you know, do we need the megaphone of the Western civilization?
I don't think so now as much as 30, 40 years ago, because now there are audiences within the continent, and there's a whole ecosystem that does not rely on. There are writers who are as popular without winning any big prizes. You know, so this is you know, and it's also about how people organize within the continent to try and leverage their own forms of cultural capital. So I think the degrees of that is a lot less than, and often you'll find that people who go out to win big prizes and expose themselves there do it very consciously, because they know that then they can transfer those forms of capital very consciously. In fact, when they do that, their primary audience is not necessarily the West. Their ultimate primary audience is coming back to the continent. So there's also a consciousness around, you know, around cultural ecosystem.
Thank you. It was very interesting series. I'm quite interested in the way today I'm moving from sort of language and nation into the idea of gender and feminism. I think you're trying to complicate the idea of feminism. So you've been speaking about, when you sort of introduced your theoretical context, I was quite interested in the way you were speaking about feminism or Black African feminism as perhaps a practice or a set of ethics or ideas that perhaps precede the concept or the terminology. Then you were speaking a bit about the way this is really about looking at the relationships between gender and the nation. So, what was interesting is that it kind of brings up sort of internal hierarchies which are less perhaps obvious than we were speaking about. Chair burned away, even within post-colonial frames or constructs, gender hierarchies within the category of race, and that works the other way as well. That within the category of gender, there So I guess, I mean, what wasn't very clear, the question I'm asking is this. When you speak about black feminism, is that simply feminism in Africa? Or is it something discrete, black African feminism? Feminism in Africa then just implies a kind of more Eurocentric bias.
I think suddenly the first wave of feminists in the continent at the time became aware of the kind of racial differences, racial context in which feminism could operate. And I guess they began to, it wasn't just a derivative discourse, I think they began to recognize the context within the continent that meant that a woman or femininity in the continent had its own very distinct environments and challenges that it dealt with. And one could not assume that feminism as an intellectual movement could simply translate easily from Europe to the continent. I think that was the basic idea. And I think there was a lot of modeling around, womanism. There was a lot of modeling around African American kind of critical race in relation to feminism at the time. So,
are the concepts of feminism or universal Western feminism that was speaking back against, or is it about translation?
I guess it's both. Partly also because that wave of African writers were very much writing back. At one level, they are writing back to say that we are organizing ourselves. We are an intellectual community that is beginning to refocus our audience to the continent. So I think they were both. They were doing Christian and tradition, somewhere in between longer contact with Europe and the kind of local customs. So there are three very, very disparate regions, not just in language, but also in religion, in culture, and all of that. And the British colonial governor at the time, in the early 20th century, Frederick Lugard, apparently sitting in his kitchen, decided, let's just put all of these regions together and call them one country. And they were lumped together, and they became, British colonial Nigeria. And even though there was an awareness that the people in the north did not want to associate themselves with the people in the south, they had their own way of doing things. And so when you think about Boko Haram, you heard about Boko Haram. I mean, one has to go back to those histories of map making, these decisions that are made around how borders of countries, how different countries become nation states in that regard. It's always fascinating when we think about Lesotho's relationship geographically to South Africa, which is a country in another country. Often when you look at a map, countries are contiguous to each other, and there's a really weird concentric relationship, and this assumption that Lesotho is radically different, and that it has to be borders around it in relation to South Africa. So it's map making, has a long history of kind of imperialism that one has to grapple with. So Boko Haram, the effects of Boko Haram, for me, when we think about Boko Haram now, we have to go back to those earlier kind of imperial forms of map making, decisions that were made around cartography. So Biafra then ended up becoming one of the biggest flashpoints in Nigeria's history. And there was obviously it wasn't just the cultural differences. There was the oil, the resources of oil that were in the southeastern part of the country. And so if you read many of her novels, there are a few biographical things that come up in those novels. One of the interesting things was that when she was growing up as a girl, she had to convince her father the importance of going to school, because she was overlooked in favor of her brothers, and eventually she was sent to school, and she ended up being the person that she is. So she's one of the pioneering female modern African authors, and she has over 20 books that she's published, and the ones that are put there are just a few ones that are more popular and more widely read, and you can tell from the titles that there are certain thematic concerns that are important for her. When she moved to the UK and got married to this guy, she ended up getting 5 kids, and at some point her husband, I think, was quite jealous of her kind of writing profession, and she had published, I think, 2 or 3 novels, and he ended up taking one of the manuscripts for, I think, the Bride Prize, and actually burning it.
Sure.
And then she had to recover it and rewrite it again, and so she's a really interesting author in that regard. But of course, also very accomplished, and in some ways a trailblazer for many female authors in the continent in that regard. So over 20 books. These are just some of the few that she's known for. Destination Biafra is particularly interesting because I don't know if you're aware of the civil war that took place in Nigeria between 1967 and 1970. It's been a topic of conversation for a while. And she's one of the few female authors who tries to grapple with not just the role of women, but the consciousness around gender and sexuality in relation to that war at the time. But what is interesting about her, the kind of, if I could call them the contexts of gender in Nigeria that go back to the late 19th century, and I'm going to talk about it. There's a long history of women who mobilized at different times in the country, in the face of British colonialism, in the face of local forms of patriarchy, in the face of various forms of economic organization. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But Destination Biafra is an interesting text with regards to that whole narrative about the Civil War. And you know that close to 3 million people died at the time. Most of them were children. Those of you who would have read stories or watched videos or been alive at the time, you would have known that there were campaigns all over the world to try and resolve the crisis that led to the conflict. Basically, if I can quickly just summarize what the Biafran War was about, the southeastern state of the country decided to secede from the larger Federal Republic of Nigeria. And this is part of what we have been trying to grapple with people like Ngugi and Aiko Eyama, the crisis of the nation state. When different groups of people are suddenly forced to live together, and they have to refer to themselves as Nigerians or South Africans, often these kinds of conflicts began to emerge. And what's interesting about Nigeria is that the northern part of the country was predominantly Muslim. It had a long history of Islamic contact from North Africa, from Asia. And so for centuries, it was very much embedded in Islamic civilization. And then the southern part was more somewhere in between. Sorry, I'm a little late, and I'll have to leave 10-15 minutes before the end of the lecture because I have to drop somebody at the airport. It's quite urgent, so sorry that I'll have to kind of quickly go through what I have to go through today. And I don't have a lapel mic, but I think I can project my voice loud enough. Can you hear me? When you said no, I knew you could hear. Yeah. What do you call it? The roving mic has run out of battery, so I'm just going to have to project. So today we're going to talk about The Joys of Motherhood, which is a text by a very important African writer, Buchi Echete, one of the pioneering female writers in the continent. And I'm hoping that you managed to get a hold of the book. It was published in 1979, and she is considered one of the earliest writers in the continent, at least in the modern, at the time that modern institutions around storytelling were being set, who was grappling with gender as a category of analysis, as a category of identity, in various aspects of gender, as you can see in the novel. So, what I'm going to try and do is to try and frame Buchi Echete in relation to African literary feminism, or African feminist literary criticism. It's the rise of African feminism, the rise of feminism as an intellectual project. in the continent. Obviously, one can't do justice to how big and how wide and how complex feminism as an intellectual project is, but I'll just put out a few pointers, drop a few names that I'm hoping you can pick up on your own and figure this out, and then we can just quickly talk about the text, and then I'm going to have to dash out very quickly. Can you hear me at the back?
Maybe we should come forward.
I'm so sorry. Usually the roving mic, they usually leave it charging here. I think someone might have forgotten to leave it there, so kind of run out of battery. Can you hear me at the back? Okay. If you can't hear me, if at any point you can't hear me, just raise your hand and I'll try and project. So just a few biographical facts about Uche Necheta is that she was born in July 1944 in Nigeria, and she moved to the UK at the age of 16 in 1960. Studied sociology at the University of London, and she moved to the UK because she was getting married to someone that she had been betrothed, and it turned out to be a really crazy marriage, and it was violent. And part of her project of writing was actually to grapple with her status as a woman and as a mother who wanted to pursue her own profession and go to school.